So first, it's a pleasure for me to introduce Ola Söderström, who is a geographer, professor at the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. He works especially with social and cultural geography of the city, and also around relations between urbanicity and psychosis. And he will talk about a stranger in your own city. Please.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Jon Olaf. As Jon Olaf said, I'm coming from another tribe, the tribe of geographers, and I've been in this very welcoming tribe for a few days. It's been a great time, very interesting time. To be with you, heterodox or even sometimes heretic people working on mental health. And I've learned a lot, and I hope I can give you some ideas or some results that might be. I'm going to talk about part of the work we've been doing during the past 5 years in an interdisciplinary team of researchers in Switzerland. Here you have this magnificent team of people we've been working with. It's been a great experience since 1914. What we've been working on is not so much the figure of the stranger, this emblematic figure of urban society that Georg Simmel, one of the founders of urban studies, identified as such in the late 19th century. And I won't talk about migration either. What we have been doing is that we've been looking at ordinary urban living and the relation of ordinary urban living to psychosis. But before I talk about that, I will just say a few words about how I position this research regarding this theme of the conference, which is migration. And I have a very simple take on that, maybe too simple, you'll tell me in the discussion, which is that the takeaway message from recent studies on migration and psychosis is that in reality, migration is a misnomer for adversity. And I say that because, oh, fantastic, this is mixed up. Because if you read this recent meta-analysis by Zelten et al., they analyzed studies on migration and psychosis between 1977 and 2017, so 40 years of research. They have concluded, like other studies in the past 15 years, that ethnic minority status, rather than migration, is the important factor in the development of psychosis. And in the same vein, the researcher, the psychiatrists in the team you saw earlier, have looked at the difference between migrants and migrants in adversity in their group of people they've been following in an early psychosis program in Switzerland. And what they found is two things. They found that the prevalence of psychosis is much higher in people who, according to the information they have about them, have migrated in adversity rather than have migrated through their free will, if you like. So the rate of people who have migrated in adversity in this group of people followed for psychosis is much higher than in the average population. And the second finding is that migrants in adversity in their experience and in their clinical experience are less likely to reach symptom remission. Whereas if you've taken the same group of now 500 people who have followed this early detection program, early intervention program since 2004, the results for people who have simply migrated through their free will, their remission is the same as people who don't have a migratory background. Another recent review paper by Dijkshorn and Kirkbride shows also that among the main hypotheses proposed to account for this long-standing finding that there is a higher rate of psychotic disorder in migrants, the only robust explanation is the role of social adversities before, during, or after migration, which you see here at the top. So they've gone through all these different hypotheses, misdiagnosis, selection effects, and the only robust one in research during the past decades is social adversities. So I think that in these turbulent political times, I don't think I need to mention any politician or any social movement to indicate what I'm thinking about. We know how migration can be a misnomer for very different things, for things that have not so much to do with migration, but have to do with fear, with injustice, with inequality, with unemployment. And it seems clear to me that in psychiatric research, migration has also been a placeholder for other phenomena. And these other phenomena are violence, abuse, threat, and stress. So I think, and this is why how I position our research with regard to this research, that what we should be talking about when we deal with psychosis is to talk about these things: violence, abuse, threat, and stress in migrant population and in non-migrant populations. So, in other words, I've been a bit troubled by the certainly unintentional, ambiguous politics of the image we've been seeing for a few days. I don't know about you, but I've been thinking that, and this connects to what I'm saying, we're not talking about that stranger with the hoodie, like a bit probably threatening in our visual unconscious. What we are talking about is not this faceless figure, but a person who would turn around, who can look whatever he can look like, brown, white, black, and we should look this person in the face. And we know Emmanuel Levinas has explained to us how important, when we deal with the alterity, the face is, the gaze we can exchange. And I think we should look this person in the face and ask two very simple questions. The first one is, what has happened to you? What has happened to you for you to be in such psychological distress? And the second question we should be asking is, how can we help? And I'm taking these two simple questions out of the excellent power, threat, meaning framework, in which a series of important experienced people from the ISPS have been very active. And for those of you who don't know this report, I really encourage you to read it. It's really excellent and very powerful in its messages. So to get to our research now, what we've been looking at is not migration per se, but stress. This is why it's in red here. And when you stress, of course, you need to consider different aspects of stress. So we've been looking at stress in ordinary urban situations, but stress, of course, is related to a series of other factors. If we take Perlin's influential stress process theory, in his theory, stress is composed of structural factors, such as economic inequality, individual social position, demographic characteristics, and geographic context. So we've been looking at geographic context, but also individual social position. But of course, we've been acknowledging that this is not all there is to it. Stress is also related to these structural factors as well. And I've been thinking about that because I sent a paper in, and I got this feedback from one of the reviewers. I think we all have our kind of Marxist background, or very often we have that when we read text, and the feedback I got from, what about structural factors? So, of course, structural factors, but I won't be talking about that. I will be talking about urban situations. So we have been guided in our research all along the way by this research question: how, when, and where is a sense of stress or protection occasioned in young psychotic patients' experience of urban milieus? And the way we've been looking at it, drawing on research in the social sciences and in the geographies of mental health in particular, is to look at things through these, to look at experience as structured by these three elements: social interaction, the built environment, which is very often out of the picture. We have problems in psychiatry and in the social sciences, I think, very often, and that's a problem I have personally with phenomenology, to look at materiality. And the third point is mobility. We know how mobility is part and parcel of the daily lives of people living in psychological distress very often. The way we've been looking at this is we've been following this methodological pathway. So the step one of our research was to video record go-alongs or walk-alongs with participants, and then to discuss these videos, so-called video elicitation interviews, so as to start with images rather than abstract questions, to generate a series of hypotheses regarding what we've been looking at, this relation between urban living and psychosis. And then, in the second step, we've been trying to look at this in a more fine-grained way, so intensifying the forms of results or hypotheses we had by looking at the videos themselves. So that's the left-hand circle you have there, and then we've been trying to see to what extent this can be generalized. How robust are these qualitative findings? And my colleagues in psychiatry don't like qualitative results. We've been looking at this through a survey we've been passing to all people who have been involved in this intervention program. What we've been doing, and I've been asked to focus on videos, so I won't talk about the survey unless you ask me questions later. So I will be focusing on the things here on the left-hand side. So practically we've been doing 10 go-alongs. It's complicated, as you can imagine, to set up as a process. 10 go-alongs with a patient in the program and with the partners of their choice, and we did 10 non-recorded go-along because of the complexity of the technological side of it. And these go-alongs have had a duration of between 40 and 2 hours, 40 minutes and 2 hours. And then 1 to 2 weeks later, we met with the participants and we made these interviews based on watching the videos. And then we looked at these videos with the video elicitation interviews between psychiatrists, geographers, and we're trying to make sense of them by looking at them together, so in a very interdisciplinary analysis. And on the other hand, the linguists in the team, and I'll show you how they worked, they really looked specifically at the videos themselves for the reason that there is very often a difference between a discourse about practice, what people say about what they do, and the practice itself. And so we were trying to work with this gap between discourse about action and action itself. So this is how it looked like. On the left-hand side, you have the image of one of the go-alongs with 3 different cameras and 2 mics. And we can also talk about this quite heavy equipment later on if you like. And on the right-hand side, you have one of these video elicitation sessions where we look at the videos and we talk about them, or we just stay in silence. There was a nice discussion we had in a workshop about silence, how you handle silence. And here you have the map of the different go-alongs we did. A few words about the results now. What did we find out by working with these interviews? This is summarized in a paper that came out 3 years ago, and what we found out is the importance of, in terms of experience of stress, of the density of people and buildings, the importance of sensory overload, so oral, visual, haptic stimulations in the city, the importance of the experience of stress related to unchosen social interaction, and the importance of hindrances to mobility, the fact of feeling trapped, and here's where the built environment comes in, being trapped in the fabric of the city, if you like. So if you are aware of the literature in psychiatry on so-called urbanicity, which is a term that I contest, I don't think it's a good term, but I'll say a few words maybe about that later. If we take the literature on urbanicity, these things have been quite well discussed. So density, sensory overload, and what my colleagues in psychiatry call social defeat. The thing I think we add here is that we with the videos and with being out of the lab and out of the clinic, we can explore these forms of stress as situated, context-dependent phenomena. In other words, here is where the geographic context, here is where individual social position comes in, because we see that stress can be experienced or not, depending on where you are. Places like shopping malls, bus rides, were recurrently explained or described as problematic in the accounts of our participants. The same is true for density. Density in research on urbanicity is very often simply the number of people per square meter. And if you listen to Laura, we call her Laura, among other different persons who talked about density, she says the following: I like to immerse myself like an ant in the crowd. I like to hear the noise of the crowd, the musicians playing. In fact, I like feeling alone but surrounded. I feel I belong to society, but without being too exposed. That probably is quite familiar to you. That is something that came very often, this fact of belonging but not being exposed, how we can balance between the two. And Laura also said that what she finds very stressful is to be in a smaller space with a series of not unknown persons, but persons that she knows. So that form of density is problematic. But the other form of density that seems to be prevalent in the literature in psychiatry is not a problem for her. So in other words, we need to have a better understanding of where these things happen, how they can be located and situated. So now, a few words about the video analysis itself. And here what we did is, I'll just show you what it looks like. Let's see how it works. So we had those 3 cameras, as you saw, and then, so this is the kind of rough material we worked on. Not totally rough, but because these shots were here synchronized. But here you see, without sound, but it doesn't really matter. There is sound.
Ah ouais, non, c'est moche, ouais. Mais c'est pour ça. C'est pour ça qu'il ne faut pas courir là, mais courir là-bas, dans cette direction. Voilà, ouais.
Okay, this is just to show you, it's a very banal thing. Crossing a street. So what we've been doing is to work on a series of activities, recurring activities in the city, to closely watch what's happening, to make those observations that maybe did not pop up in the discussions. And what the linguists and the team have been doing is a multimodal analysis. So they've been looking at speech, conversation, and the relation between conversation and bodily movement. And through that, trying to trace, and you can see how they relate the images where you see the bodily movement with parts of this very simple conversation. And what they've been trying to look at is to what extent you can see, by playing on these two different modalities of human action, how things are noticed, how things are problematic or not, through ways of moving away from your partner, from hesitations, from all kinds of small things that happen and often get unnoticed in ordinary interaction. So what happened here is that, as I said, we were trying to work on the tension between interviews and video analysis, and sometimes we saw convergences. So here's an example of a convergence. So by looking closely at, and then looking at one thing, who is in charge of leading the way? And here you can see that the participant on the right is actually leading the way. She tries to go straight on, and he turns to the left, and then she eventually follows. And this participant, like other participants in the study, said how important it is to be directing and to be controlling the trajectory in the city. And it is important because it's a way of managing unpredictability and to managing the stress that is related to unpredictable encounters, or encounters with the environment or with other people. So that's one form of relation between different results. Another relation is that, or this is the non-relation in ways that, in the sense that in this video analysis we also found elements that we had not seen before. And this is one which is about noise. And if you look at studies in psychiatry on noise, there are many studies on noise. And so far, these studies have been based on self-report descriptions, sound evaluation by patients, or tasks observed in the lab setting. So to use this useful distinction of a sociologist of science, Michel Caron, between research in the lab and research in the wild, if you take that problem out of the lab in the wild, which is, I think, how people in social sciences and in psychiatry, psychology can very fruitfully work together. So if you take the situation out in the wild, you see other things. You see real-time situations of the confrontation to noise in the city. So what we've been looking at is how the sound was noticed, how it was reacted to, how it was commented on or not, and what happened in the interaction through just paying attention to sound. And what it shows is that, it shows two things. That the first thing is that service users react, so they comment, they explain noise more than their partners, who tend to minimize perceived nuisance if you look at the the different reactions to noise. And this is, of course, not really surprising. The sensitivity to noise is a well-known figure, in its connection with cognitive problems is well known in the literature on psychosis. The other thing is more interesting, and this is exactly what research in the wild brings, is that when we look at these videos, we see that active engagement in the conversation decreases attention to noise. So in the sense that when you talk with somebody, when you walk in the street with somebody, you create a kind of conversational bubble. And this conversational bubble seems to work as a modulator of noise and thereby also probably as a modulator of stress. And this is what you see here. This is a part of the video, just a few shots. And this is shot at the end of a 1 hour walk, more or less. And at the beginning of the walk, there was a very loud noise. And it was not noticed by the participant and hardly by the partner either. They were talking, and the conversation was kind of shielding it off. And then by the end of the go along, exactly in terms of decibel, the same kind of noise happened. And you can see here that one of the participant, the patient, moves away, and he's very irritated in the discussion. So he's troubled. It's as if the kind of bubble of protection bursts. So this is convergent with things we've been, this is another aspect. So it's not about stress, but how tactics of patients help them to manage urban stress. So this bubble, this sensory bubble is one of the ways that patients have been telling us they create to manage stress. But they also use niches and breaks in the city, and they, as we saw before, they very carefully program their trajectories in the city to avoid being exposed to stressful encounters. And this is published in Psychosis, an excellent journal, 2 years ago. So these were a series of results, and to explain, because this was the task I was given, what we can do with videos. Now I just conclude with two elements, which is where we move from here, what kind of research we're doing, because the research is more or less finished now. The first step is to look more closely at, even more closely at urban stress. And this is what we call a biosensory ethnography. And this is planned to be done in Basel, so a larger city in Switzerland, an industrial city, the home of pharmaceutical companies who very generously and in a very disinterested way help you, or doctors in the audience in your work. And as we put it in a forthcoming paper with my doctoral student, Mark Wiens, what we're looking at is how the city goes not under the skin, but to the skin. So we're working, we plan to work, we haven't done that, that is going to begin next month. We're working with a wrist watch with GPS, and the indicator we will be using in the wristwatch is electrodermal activity, so an indicator of arousal and possibly pre-cognitive affective processes. And probably when Ines is going to talk about her work, there's a small difference between the way we work on that. And this will be completed by narratives, observations. So if the electrodermal activity is the bio in the biosensory ethnography, or the physiological aspect more precisely, the ethno is working with map elicitation interviews, using the observations and the discourse of people. So, and we'll be looking at things we found as probably very important in the relation to the urban setting is moments of transition, thresholds, threshold effects in the city, and sensory dimensions. That's the kind of research part of where we are moving now. The other direction here, the psychiatrists in the team have the lead, and we have a forthcoming paper, I can skip that one for reasons of time, on what we call urban remediation. So the idea here is that if the city can be stressful, it is, of course, and you all know that from your clinical experience or your personal experience, it is also a very important resource. So how can we, if the city works as a mediator, and is one of the possible factors in the onset of psychosis, how can we also work with the urban milieu as a factor of remediation. So how can we work with the resources? How can we use the knowledge we generated with our prior research on bubbles, on those forms of protective activities to help in the recovery process? And you will be talking about recovery process in a minute. So these are the two directions in which we are moving right now as a continuation of this interdisciplinary research. So to wrap it up and to try to finish in time, I've been arguing the following things. The first thing is that we should study adversity, violence, stress, rather than migration per se. So we should be studying these things in migrant populations or non-migrant populations. We should be looking at stress in cities, if we study that, in its structural and situational dimensions. So if we looked at the situational dimensions, it is because there's a lot of excellent work on structural factors in London, for instance, by Stephanie Hatch and others. We should use a combination of video elicitation and video analysis as methods to grasp the geographic and social dimensions of stress beyond the declarative mode. So this is where I part a little with my excellent colleagues in the Netherlands working on this, because they ask people to express their stress, and we think we should be working also at how stress affects us in an unconscious way. And finally, a better knowledge of these situations, we think has implications for therapeutic strategies and urban planning. So this was it. Many thanks for your attention.